Okay, hello everyone, and this is a revision lesson focusing on the League of Nations and International Peace as part of AQA's GCSE History, Conflict and Tension, 1918 to 1939 course. Today we're going to focus on the League of Nations, how it was formed, how it was organised, how it worked, what powers the League had. Quite a lot to cover here. We're going to look at the League's agencies, how the League contributed to peace in the 1920s, and looking at the overall successes and failures of the League, including the Islands, Upper Silesia, Vilna, Corfu, and Bulgaria. So without further ado, let's go. So what was the League of Nations? Well, the League of Nations is very much the idea of President Woodrow Wilson. He came up with the idea. It's a kind of like a world parliament. The equivalent today, of course, is the United Nations that was set up at the end of the Second World War. Now, when the League of Nations was formed, it met for the first time in 1920. It was based in Geneva, in Switzerland, which was chosen for the fact that Switzerland was a neutral country. It had a covenant, which is basically the key rules of the League of Nations, how it would work. And the idea was that all members should send a representative to what was called the Assembly of the League of Nations, which would meet once a year. The League also had a council, and the idea would be that that would meet regularly and would be made up of permanent members and then elected representatives. Now, initially, there was supposed to be 5 permanent members, which would have been Britain, France, Italy, Japan, and the USA. But of course, the USA never joined, so there are only 4 permanent members in the actual League of Nations. The other idea of the League was that all members would reduce their weapons, they would disarm, but the League would not have its own army. Britain and America were particularly keen for the League to not have its own army, even though France wanted it to have its own army. Members will respect each other's independence, and this is a very, very important concept. The League will provide collective security to all of its members and protect one another if invaded. The other idea is if any member breaks the covenant, then the League's members will stop trading with that country and send an army to stop the fighting. Now, there's multiple examples in the history of the League of Nations, most notably the Japanese invasion of Manchuria in 1931. And the Italian invasion of Abyssinia in October 1935, which showed that in practice did not happen. The League also had a really important duty, which is important for you to not neglect, in terms of improving the health and working conditions around the world. So there's various League of Nations agencies like the Health Commission and the International Labour Organization that you need to know about as well. So one of the first things to really get a grip on is the membership of the League of Nations. Now, when the League is formed, and the map here shows you which countries were actually members of the League of Nations, and remember, many countries around the world were colonies of members of the League of Nations as well at this time. These were some of the key members. So you can see there's quite a lot of countries in South America that were members. Countries like Canada and Australia, and it grew to over 50 in the 1930s. But what's absolutely crucial for you to understand at the start is that countries that were defeated in World War I were not allowed to join at first. The key one to understand as well and get into your minds is that the USA never joined, and you'll probably remember the gap in the bridge cartoon, which is a wonderful metaphor for showing this. So these show you the key kind of countries and when they were members. So Britain and France were members all the way through from 1919 to 1945. Italy was a member from 1919 until 1937 when it left after the Abyssinian crisis. Japan, member from 1919 to 1933, left over the Manchurian crisis. Germany was a member from 1926 to 1933 when Hitler took Germany out in October 1933 after pulling out of the World Disarmament Conference. And then the Soviet Union, well, they joined in 1934 when they were looking for a little bit more support and alliances when they were worried about the threat of Germany. They left in 1939 after the Nazi-Soviet pact and the invasion of Poland. So it's important to have that in your head, some of the different members of the League of Nations during this time. So it's crucial to think about why the absence of the USA from the League of Nations is so significant. So if you look at the cartoon from Punch magazine, which was produced in December 1919, this shows you how crucial it was that America was not part of the League of Nations. So what it says there is the League of Nations bridge was designed by the President of the USA, and yet the USA is shown sort of relaxing at the side of the bridge. And the idea is that the USA was the keystone. This was the key element of the League which would hold it all together and make it strong and stable. And without the USA being there, it's a little bit of a patchwork organisation, the League of Nations. Yes, it's got countries like France and Belgium and England and Italy in it, and of course Japan. But ultimately, without the USA, the League of Nations will be made to be weak, and that's crucial. So why is the League of Nations weak without the USA? Well, firstly, the USA and President Wilson was really enthusiastic about the League of Nations, whereas Britain and France tended to focus on their own self-interest. They needed to recover from the war themselves. And we see multiple examples, particularly in the 1930s, of Britain and France acting in their own self-interest. So we think about, particularly after the Italian invasion of Abyssinia, when the Hall of Vow Pact is created. That's going to be a great example for that, which we'll find out about in future revision videos. The economy. The USA is the richest country in the world, so economic sanctions aren't going to work very well if countries can carry on trading with America. And there's multiple examples of that. For example, when Japan invades Manchuria in 1931, when Italy invades Abyssinia in 1935, when those countries can carry on trading with the USA and avoid the worst impact of economic sanctions. And then militarily, the USA had the largest empire. It was the most powerful country in the world during this time. So the fact that the USA wasn't in the League of Nations hugely undermines that principle of collective security. Had the USA been a member, countries like Germany, Italy, Japan, etc., they probably would have been less willing to break the rules of international law during that time, to break the rules of the various peace treaties. So the absence of the USA is a crucial reason for why the League of Nations struggled, and ultimately, I suppose, why the League of Nations failed. Now then, this slide just shows you how the League of Nations was organised. So there was an assembly where each member sent one representative to the assembly each year. All decisions had to be agreed by everyone. We call that making a unanimous decision. There's almost like a civil service type secretariat that kept records of meetings, prepared reports, groups of experts could provide advice. There was the Permanent Court of International Justice, which could solve international disputes. However, very difficult to actually enforce those decisions, especially without an army. There's a council, which is made up of 4 permanent members, France, Britain, Italy, and Japan. Remember, the USA would have been the 5th permanent member, but of course they never joined. And the first 4 non-permanent members were Spain, Brazil, Greece, and Belgium, just for your own interest, which is one of the reasons why Belgium appeared on that Gap in the Bridge cartoon before. And they would meet several times a year, they would make decisions, they would deal with crises. And then there were various League of Nations agencies, which we're going to find out a bit more about in just a second. So there's the International Labour Organization, the Mandates Commission, the Slavery Commission, the Refugees Commission, and of course the Health Commission, which later will become known as the World Health Organization. Okay, now one of the key things of the League of Nations is that it was designed to resolve disputes. And as that cartoon that was published in the USA in 1919 about the League of Nations shows that the League of Nations, its whole kind of concept and idea was about enabling the world to recover from the chaos and the upset of the First World War. And it was seen as a beacon of hope for the world into the 1920s. So the League of Nations was set up to resolve disputes, and people hoped that this would prevent wars in the future. This was certainly Woodrow Wilson's idea when he came up with it within his 14 points. So what could the League actually do? Well, it could use mediation to resolve disputes by discussing in them at the League of Nations Council. It could use what was called moral persuasion, so it could simply tell countries to stop. This was kind of like telling a country off, if you like. This was known as moral condemnation. Probably more effective than that would be economic sanctions, where the League could stop trading with a country that was in the wrong. So that was known as an economic sanction, and this is used against Japan and Italy in the 1930s. Remember, though, with the USA not being a member, these sanctions weren't always effective. And they could also take military action. The League didn't have its own army, but it could order its members to provide soldiers to fight for it. So we mentioned before about the work of the League of Nations agencies, and it's important that you are aware of some of the work of these different agencies. So the first agency is the Disarmament Commission. That's set up in 1926 to prepare for a World Disarmament Conference, which is actually held in 1932. It's key to understand that France is pretty unwilling to disarm, and France is quite nervous. It starts to build the Maginot Line into the 1930s to protect itself from what it sees as a risk of a future invasion. And you can see here that Germany actually left that conference and the League in protest in 1933. There's the Refugees Commission, set up to house refugees after the First World War. It also created the Nansen Passport, which was named after a Norwegian explorer, which allowed refugees to be able to get into other countries by providing them with a passport. There's the Health Commission that tackled diseases like smallpox and international campaign to kill mosquitoes to tackle malaria. The Slavery Commission freed 200,000 from slavery in Sierra Leone in Africa and led to the abolition of slavery in countries like Iraq in 1924, in Nepal in 1926, and in Sierra Leone itself in 1927. The International Labour Organization was set up to improve working conditions. So in 1928, 77 countries agreed a minimum wage, but it had less success in terms of banning children under 14 from working and limiting the working day to 8 hours a day. It also did ban the use of lead in white paint. So it made some steps to improve working conditions during this time. And then the Mandates Commission was set up to govern Germany's former colonies. There are other commissions around setting up rules around transport, setting up things like shipping lanes, for example, and the Permanent Central Opium Board to tackle the drug trade as well, the illegal drug trade. So some real successes there in terms of the work of the League of Nations agencies, that's for sure. Right then, so you need to have some examples for how the League of Nations tackled international disputes. So the first one we're going to have a look at is Upper Silesia. Now, the Treaty of Versailles basically said that a plebiscite, which is like a referendum, a vote really, should decide whether Upper Silesia should be ruled by Poland or Germany, because it's an area which is rich in iron and steel production, just between there, you can see on the map, between Germany and Poland. It's an area where Polish people and German people were living in it. So anyway, a plebiscite took place in March 1921, as set up by the Treaty of Versailles, and 60% of people voted to join Germany. But Poland said the vote had been unfair. So what the League did is they set up a commission, a group of people to investigate, and they decided that Upper Silesia should be divided between Poland and Germany, matching how people voted. So the areas where lots of people voted for Germany, that should stay with Germany. The areas where lots of people voted for Poland, that should stay with Poland. But what it meant is that Germany ended up with mostly of the rural areas, whilst Poland got the industrial areas. Germany was quite upset about this. It complained it had lost the coal mines, and Poland was upset because they said they only got a third of the land. In the end, though, this was a dispute which the League of Nations managed to solve, and you can see this on the cartoon here, and both accepted the League's decision. So another really good example of the successes of the League of Nations in the 1920s is over the disputed Ireland Islands. Now you can see there on the map with the little red circle, that's where the Ireland Islands is, and also in that other map just at the bottom, it's between Sweden and Finland, probably about equidistant. Now the islands were Swedish speaking, but the League decided that they should remain controlled by Finland. Now, Sweden's a bit concerned about the islands being controlled by Finland, but a special treaty is actually created to guarantee that Finland could not put weapons or fortifications on the islands, so that they didn't threaten Sweden's security. And the treaty also guaranteed that Swedish language and culture would be respected. So it's a great example of the League successfully resolving a dispute. So if you need an example of the League of Nations being able to solve an international dispute, the Islands is a really good one to use. So Vilna, as you can see there, was the capital of Lithuania. So Poland and Lithuania both gained independence after the First World War. Now, Poland wanted to gain control of the city of Vilna after the First World War because most of the population living in Vilna were in fact Polish. So in October 1920, Polish soldiers basically invaded and took control of Vilna. Now, Lithuania appealed to League of Nations for help, said that they suffered at the hands of an aggressor, and in this case, Britain and France decided not to challenge Poland. This was partly because France saw Poland as an important ally, potentially, against Germany, and therefore Vilna remained under Polish control. Lithuania refused to accept this decision. They said it was unfair, and they'd had their land taken off them. The League of Nations hadn't guaranteed their safety, and Lithuania and Poland remained in a state of war. So this is an example of the League being unable to solve a problem, And I think what it shows is that when the League was faced by a stronger and more powerful country like Poland was after the First World War, they were unable to resolve the conflict. So next up, a really good example, this one, for another aspect that's unsuccessful about League of Nations in the 1920s, and it's the Italian invasion of the Greek island of Corfu in 1923. And again, you can see a map there. So what happened in August 1923, an Italian general who's called Enrico Tellini and 4 of his staff, they were actually assassinated on the Greek-Albanian border. Now, the Greek government blamed Albanian criminals at the time, and they said that that they weren't involved, but the Italians at the same time said, well, actually, it was Greek soldiers that were responsible. Now, Italy demanded an apology, they demanded compensation, and they gave the Greeks 1 day to accept the terms and 5 days for the compensation. The Greeks refused, and as a response, the Italian leader Mussolini bombed and then invaded Corfu. Now, Greece appealed to the League of Nations for help, but Mussolini said he didn't want the League of Nations to be involved and threatened to actually leave the League of Nations if it interfered. So the crisis was actually resolved by a small organisation known as the Conference of Ambassadors. They argued that Italy should withdraw from Corfu, but that Greece should pay a 50 million lira fine. So again, the event showed the sort of weakness of the League of Nations, particularly in dealing with a more powerful country. And basically Mussolini had been able to get away with invading the Greek island of Corfu. So Bulgaria in 1925, so again Greece is involved in this one. In 1925, Greek soldiers were killed by Bulgarian troops, again along a border incident. Bulgaria apologised and said the incident should be investigated, but as a response, Greece invaded Bulgaria. Now, the Bulgarian government ordered its troops to make only small resistance, but they evacuated people, about 10 to 15,000 people from the border area, and they asked the League of Nations to settle the dispute. Now, the League ordered Greece to withdraw from Bulgaria. Greece obeyed, but they said that the League of Nations was hypocritical because when Italy had done something which was pretty similar, this event is actually quite similar to what happened with Italy and Greece, that Italy had been treated differently. So what this event shows, and if you have this alongside the Italian invasion of Corfu, Corfu being obviously an island of Greece, the League of Nations were able to successfully resolve the dispute, but only when it was dealing with smaller powers. So overall, how successful is the League of Nations in the 1920s? Well, there's lots of evidence for success there, and you can have a look through them. The agencies achieved great things. Slavery is tackled, the Health Commission. They resolved disputes like the Ireland Islands and when Greece invades Bulgaria. The League of Nations began to allow other countries in, such as Germany joining in 1926. The Permanent Central Opium Board was tackling the drug trade. But again, there's lots of evidence of failures as well. So the agencies can't agree everything with each other. So the International Labour Organization doesn't get to reduce the working day to 8 hours or restrict child labour. When the Great Depression begins to happen at the end of the 1920s into the 1930s, it's unable to solve those problems. There's an uneasy solution Upper Silesia, but doesn't really please either side, and it really fails when Poland takes control of Lithuania and are able to stand up to Italy when they invade the Greek island of Corfu. So overall, this would be my conclusion that I would say, if you were to ask me how successful the League of Nations was in the 1920s. Yet, it was successful in some areas, but ultimately it can't stand up to the strongest and most powerful countries, and is only able to resolve the smaller and perhaps less significant international disputes. Does make some improvements to people's lives, but ultimately, and you'll find out about this in a future revision video, but some of the most important diplomacy that takes place in the 1920s has nothing to do with the League of Nations. So we're thinking about things like the Washington Naval Conference, the Treaty of Rapallo, the Locarno Treaties, and the Kellogg-Briand Pact. None of them actually take place within the actual League of Nations. So that was a revision video about the League of Nations in the 1920s, what it did, how successful it was. Hope you enjoyed that. Thanks for listening. Bye-bye.